This is chapter 26 of Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken. We're jumping in at page 265. And if you remember at the end of chapter 25, Louis had just been on the Postman Calls broadcast in Tokyo, and so now his family just found out that he's alive. He's still in the camp. It's not going well, but his family knows he's alive, and that's exciting. And that brings us here to this chapter called Madness. The Radio Tokyo men were back at Omori smiling. What a lovely voice Louis had. What a brilliant job he had done. How about another broadcast? As long as he wrote his own copy, Louis saw no reason to decline. He composed another message to his family, then rode with the producers to Tokyo. When he reached the studio, the producers announced a change of plans. They didn't need the message he'd written. They had one already. They handed Louis a sheet of paper. This is what it said, exactly as written. Well, believe it or not, I guess I'm one of those lucky guys. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm really unlucky. Anyway, here's me, Louis Zamperini, age 27, hometown Los Angeles, California, good old United States of America speaking. What I mean by lucky is that I'm still alive and healthy. Yes, and it's a funny thing. I've heard and also saw with my own eyes that I'm washed up. That is, I was reported to have died in combat. Yes, one of those who died gallantly, fighting for the cause. I think the official report went something like this. First Lieutenant Louis S. Zamperini, holder of the National Interscholastic Mile record, is listed as dead by the War Department. The former University of Southern California miler was reported missing in action in the South Pacific in May 1943. Well, what do you know? Boy, that's rich. Here I am, just as alive as I could be, but hell, I'm supposed to be dead. Yeah, and this reminds me of another fellow who's in the same boat as me, or at least he was. Anyway, he told me that he was officially reported as killed in action, but in reality was a prisoner of war. After several months, he received a letter from his wife in which she told him that she had married again since she thought he was dead. Of course, she was astonished to hear that he was safe and held in an internment camp. She, however, consolated him by saying that she was willing to divorce again or marry him once again when he gets home. Boy, I really feel sorry for a fellow like that, and the blame lies with the official who allows such unreliable reports. After all, the least they can do is to let the folks back home know just where their boys are. Anyway, that's not my worry, but I hope folks back home are properly notified of the fact that I am alive and intend to stay alive. It's certainly a sad world when a fellow can't even be allowed to live. I mean, when a fellow is killed off by a so-called official report, how about that? Now, remember, this was the report that, not one that Louis wrote, but that the Japanese had written for him. And so it makes the U.S. look really bad, right? Because they reported him dead, and it's like kind of poking fun at that, and what a terrible job they did. So, there it is. Louis was aghast. He was shocked. He had long wondered why he'd been spared from execution on Kwajalein after the 9 Marines had been killed, and why he'd been subjected to the will-weakening torment of Ofuna, yet not interrogated, even though everyone else had been. At last, the Japanese had made their intentions clear. On Kwajalein, after Louis' execution had been ordered, an officer had persuaded his superiors to keep Louis alive to make him into a propaganda tool. A famous American Olympian, he'd reasoned, would be especially valuable. The Japanese had probably sent Louis to the crucible of Ofuna, then to Omori under the bird, to make his life in camp unbearable, so he'd be willing to do anything, even betray his country to escape it. They had hidden him from the world, keeping his name off Red Cross rosters, and waited until his government had publicly declared his death before announcing that he was alive. In doing so, they hoped to embarrass America and undermine American soldiers' faith in their government. So this is a propaganda piece. They're using Louis to try to embarrass the American government. Louis refused to read the statement. Still smiling, the producers asked him to join them on a little tour. They brought him to a cafeteria and served him a delicious American-style meal, then took him to the private living area that had beds with mattresses and sheets. If Louis would make the broadcast, the producer says, he could live here, and he'd never have to see Omori again. Remember, he's barely getting enough food, he's starving, he's sick, he has like paper sheets and no real mattress, so this is like heavenly to him. Finally, Louis was introduced to a group of men, Australians and Americans. These men, the producer said, were helping him make broadcasts. As Louis held out his hand, the propaganda prisoners dropped their eyes to the floor. Their faces said it all. Now note there, it doesn't say it explicitly, but if they're dropping their eyes to the floor, it means that they're embarrassed. They're ashamed of what they're doing. Even though they're getting more food, they're ashamed. Their faces said it all. If Louis agreed to make this broadcast, he would be forced into a life as his enemy's propagandist. So that means he'd be forced to be doing whatever Japan wanted him. He'd have to say whatever Japan wanted him to say against the U.S., and that would be a shameful thing to do. Louis was taken back to the studio and urged to do the broadcast. He refused. The smiles evaporated, the faces hardened. The producers ordered him to do it. He said no. The producers left the room to meet in private. Louis was alone in the studio. In front of him were several copies of the message that they wanted him to deliver. He slid his hand through a tear in his pocket, snagged a copy, and pulled it into his coat. The producers returned. "Okay," one of them said. "I think you go to punishment camp." Amori was called a punishment camp, but the producers were clearly referring to some other place. For Louis, any camp had to be better than Amori because the bird wouldn't be there. The producers gave him one last chance to change his mind. He did not. Louis was dumped back at Amori. The bird was waiting for him, glowing with renewed hatred. His beatings resumed with intensified vigor. Maybe Louis was being punished for refusing to make the broadcast, or maybe the producer to whom Louis had appealed for help had told the bird of Louis's accusations. Louis stood his ground, took his beatings with rebellion boiling in him, and waited to be shipped to punishment camp. And like all the other POWs, he watched the sky, praying that the promise of that first B-29 would be fulfilled. Remember, they believe that the B-29s are the planes that are going to be able to turn the war in favor of the Allies. So he's just hoping that the war can end. In the early afternoon on Friday, November 24th, the Tokyo sirens began to howl. From the sky came an immense shivering sound. The POWs looked up. There, so high that they appeared to be gleaming slits in the sky, were acres and acres of B-29s, 111 of them, flying toward an aircraft factory in the rim of the city. Caught in what would later be called the jet stream, the planes were streaking along at speeds approaching 445 miles per hour, almost 100 miles per hour faster than they were built to fly. The Americans had arrived. It was a cold, clear, sunny day, wrote POW Johann Arthur Johansson, not sure, who was at a slave site at the time. The planes were shining like silver in the sunshine against the blue sky overhead. It was a beautiful sight, which lifted our spirit right up to the sky. And you can see right here in the picture, it says a B-29 over Japan, and there's like the jet stream they're talking about. Men began yelling, "Drop the bombs," and "Happy landings," and "Welcome back." The guards stared up, so awed by the planes that they didn't seem to hear the men shouting. At Amori, the camp accountant, Yuicho Hato, was standing with a group of POWs. As they watched, a lone Japanese fighter raced toward the planes, then abruptly, startlingly, flew straight into a bomber, the smaller plane shattering and raining down on Tokyo Bay. The bomber began falling, white smoke twirling from it. A single parachute puffed from its side, and one of the POWs cried, "One safe, safe!" The English word caught in Hato's ear. He had heard it used only in baseball games. The bomber hit the water, killing all aboard. The lone survivor, under his parachute, wafted over Tokyo as gently as a dandelion seed. As the men sank into the city, Hato had a sick feeling, thinking of what would happen to that airman when he reached the ground. The other bombers flew on. A few minutes later, there was distant booming. As the fall stretched on, B-29s crossed over Amori nearly every day, sometimes a lone plane, sometimes vast continents of aircraft. On sunny days, the men stood out and watched them. On cloudy days, they only heard them, a growl above the gray. In Tokyo, the sirens sang so incessantly that the POWs began sleeping through them. 81 bombers went over on November 27th. On a drizzly night of November 29th and 30th, the prisoners were awakened by two incendiary raids on Tokyo's industrial areas. Incendiary means like fires. These are like fire bombs. The bombs would drop and then fire would spread everywhere. Explosions were heard far away, and the POWs could see licks of fire on the mainland, the last gasps of the 2,773 structures that burned that night. Civilians began streaming over the bridge and camping outside Amori's walls in hopes of escaping the bombs. Now, just as an aside, these what will become to known as the Tokyo fire raids are going to start to be happening, and there's just tons of these incendiary bombs being dropped over Tokyo and Japan, and they actually end up doing more total damage than even the atomic bombs will do later on. And so these bombs are crazy and really just destroy the city of Tokyo. One day that fall, Louis stood outside, watching Japanese fighters turning lupine circles around a crowd of B-29s. The battle was so high that only the giant, shining bombers were consistently visible. The fighters, tiny in contrast, flicked in and out of view as the sunlight caught them. Every little while, there was a sharp, brief burst of light alongside the bombers. To Louis, it looked like firecrackers. It was the fighters, gunned by the B-29s, blowing up. So they're seeing these little sparks of light, and it's the B-29s blowing up these little fighter planes. The bombers flew on imperious. The bird watched the scene with a stricken face. "Hikoki dame," he said, "Hikoki dame." Japan's planes, he was lamenting, were no good. Every B-29 that beat a path over Tokyo wound the bird tighter. He hounded the POWs with endless inspections, prohibited smoking, singing, and card playing, and outlawed religious services. He slapped one officer across the face repeatedly for 5 minutes, made him stand at attention coatless for hours in the cold, then ordered him to clean the benjos for 2 hours a day for 2 weeks. He beat a kitchen worker with a spoon the size of an oar. He pawed through the men's belongings, confiscating personal papers and photographs of loved ones, deeming much of it suspicious and destroying it. He was seized with paranoia. "You win war, and you make all Japanese like black slaves." So he's saying that just like in the U.S., African Americans were enslaved, not during this time, but not too far, 100 years in the past. He's saying that they would do the same thing to the Japanese. He shouted that at a POW. He hauled Martindale to his office, accused him of plotting to burn down a barracks, and beat him so energetically with fists and a kendo stick that he overturned all of the furniture. In December, the bird left camp for several days, and Amori was briefly peaceful. But on the night before the bird was slated to return, the POWs were jarred from their sleeps, like awoken suddenly from their sleep, to hear him charging through the camp in a driving rainstorm, yelling that it was a fire drill. When the designated firefighters assembled under the freezing downpour, the bird punched several of them in the face, ran through the barracks, shouting and punching other men, then ordered every man in the camp to line up outside. When Lou and the others did as told, the bird drew his sword, swung it around, and screamed orders and invectives. For 2 hours, the bird forced the men to pump water on imaginary fires, beat out phantom blazes with brooms, and run in and out of buildings rescuing food and documents. So it's pouring rain, and he's making them have this weird fire drill where they have to actually act like they're putting out a fire. As December progressed, the bird's mania deepened, so he's becoming more and more unstable, more and more unpredictable. He rounded up the officers and hounded them across the bridge into Tokyo, on the pretense of retrieving firewood from bombed-out houses. Troughs of water for firefighting had been set across the streets, and as the men marched, the bird leapt upon one, drew his sword, and screamed, "Kiri!" The men saluted him, and the bird, lost in fantasy, stood on his roost in an absurdly exaggerated troop-reviewing pose that reminded Tom Wade of Mussolini. Mussolini is the Italian, fascist leader during this time. Civilians gathered and began cheering. After the POWs had passed, the bird jumped down, ran ahead, and hopped onto another trough, shouting, striking his pose, and demanding salutes. Over and over he repeated the farce, or this kind of satire, this almost comical thing that he's doing where it's supposed to be a salute, but he's making it almost goofy, driving the men on for miles. When the bombs were falling, the bird would snap, running through the camp with his sword in the air, wailing at the men, foam flying from his mouth, lips peeled back in wicked rictus, eyes drooping, face purple. During at least 2 bombings, he prevented the POWs from seeking cover in the trenches. In one incident, he ran the POWs outside, stood them at attention, and ordered the guards to aim their rifles at them. With bombs booming, The bird raced up and down the line of terrified POWs, swinging his sword over their head. So rather than letting them go into the bomb shelters, he's making them stand outside, just exposed to the bombs. Every escalation in the bombing, so as there's more and more bombing, it brought a parallel escalation in the bird's attacks on Louis. He sped around the camp in search of the American, fuming and furious. Louis hid, but the bird always found him. 3 or 4 times a week, the bird launched himself at Louis in what Frank Tinker would call his death lunge, coming at him with fists flying, going for his face and head. Louis would emerge dazed and bleeding. He was more and more convinced that Watanabe wouldn't stop until he was dead. Louis began to come apart. At night, the bird stalked his dreams, screeching, seething, his belt buckle flying at Louis' skull. In the dreams, the smothered rage in Louis would overwhelm him, and he'd find himself on top of his monster, his hands on the corporal's neck, strangling the life from him. So Louis is sure that the bird's not going to give up on this until Louis is dead, and in his dreams, Louis starts to retaliate by killing the bird in his sleep. As Louis suffered through December, some 300 miles away, his former pilot was wasting away in a filthy, unheated barracks in the Zensuchi POW camp. Phil had been transferred to Zensuchi the previous August, joining one-legged friend Garrett, who'd been transferred from Ofuna. Remember, Phil is the one that Louis was on the raft with, and so he's still alive. Though Ofuna interrogators had spoken of Zensuchi as a plush reward, the camp was no such place. The prisoners' diet was so poor that the men wandered the compound ravenous, pulling up weeds and eating them. Their only drinking water came from a reservoir fed by runoff from rice paddies, fertilized with human excrement. Oh, okay, so there's a rice paddy field where the rice is growing, and they fertilize it with human poop. And that's the only water running off the rice paddies. That's the only water they can get in this camp. And to avoid dying of thirst, the POWs had to drink it, leaving 90% of them afflicted with dysentery. Again, the stomach sickness. In one barracks room, men lost an average of 54 pounds over 18 months. An officer estimated that 20 men fainted each day. Almost everyone had beriberi, and some men went blind from malnutrition. So from not having enough nutrients, they lose their sight. On the last day of November, they buried an American who had starved to death. There was one blessing at Zensuchi. Phil was permitted to send brief messages home on postcards. He wrote one after another. They were mailed, but got snarled in the postal system. The fall waned, and another Christmas approached, and Phil's family received none of them. A year and a half had passed since Phil had disappeared. His family remained in limbo, having heard nothing about him since his plane had gone down. In November, they had learned about Louis' broadcast. The news had been tantalizing, so tempting. They want to believe it, but frustrating. Louis had mentioned other servicemen who were with him, but the names had been obscured by static, and the transcript hadn't conveyed them with certainty. Had Louis mentioned Alan? Remember, Alan is Phil. On a Friday night in December 1944, the telephone rang in Kelsey Phillips' home. On the line was a major from the Adjutant General's office at the War Department. Probably through the Red Cross, the department had received news from Zensuchi. Alan was alive. Kelsey was jubilant. She asked the major to cable her husband and her son's fiancé, and in Washington, Cece got the news she had waited for so long. The fortune teller had said that Alan would be found before Christmas. It was December 8th. Overcome with elation, so happy, Cece called her brother to shout the news, quit her job, dashed their apartment, throwing clothes and pictures of Alan into a suitcase, and hopped on a plane back to Indiana to wait for her fiancé to come home. 4 days before Christmas, a card from Alan, written in October, finally reached home. Dear folk, hope you're all well, and I'm looking forward to being home with you. I hope we can go rabbit hunting before the season closes, Dad. Give my love to Cece, Martha, and Dick. Happy birthday, Dad. Kelsey pored over the precious slip of paper, comforted by the familiar lines of her son's handwriting. Chaplain Phillips, Phil's dad, now stationed in France, got the news on Christmas Eve. Words really cannot describe the way I feel, he wrote to his daughter. I am in an altogether new world now. I can think of nothing more wonderful. It is a real touch of all that heavens means. In a letter officially confirming that Alan was a POW, The Phillipses were asked not to speak publicly about the fact that Alan had been discovered alive. Kelsey would henceforth heed this request, but the letter had reached her too late. By the morning after the War Department's call, the news was already all over town, and stories about Alan's survival were in the local papers. The Zamparinis, who had received a similar letter stating that the War Department now believed that Louis's broadcast had been real, were also asked not to speak of it publicly. The War Department probably didn't want it known that they had erroneously, or in error wrongly, declared 2 airmen dead, especially as the Japanese were exploiting this fact. So the U.S. is trying to make their error look not quite so terrible. Kelsey was allowed to send 1 cable to her son, and she filled the other days writing letters to him. On December 14th, she wrote to Louise Zamparini. As relieved as Kelsey was for Alan, there was heaviness in her heart. Of all the men on Green Hornet, only Louis and Alan had been found. Hugh Cuppernell's mother was so demoralized that she could no longer bear to write to the other mothers. Sadie Glassman, mother of the belly gunner, Frank Glassman, had written to Louise asking if she had heard anything about Frank. Even though we have heard nothing, she wrote, the fact that you might know something makes us feel as though there might be a little hope. It is difficult to rejoice outwardly, though I do in my heart, when I think of the other mothers whom I have learned to love and realize how keenly they feel the loss that is theirs. Kelsey wrote to Louise, how my heart goes out to them, and I shall write them every one. Right? Because even though she's so excited that her son's been found, there's also this amount of knowing that of the whole crew, only Louis and Phil probably survived. As Christmas neared, Louis faltered. Starvation was consuming him. The occasional gifts from the thieves helped, but not enough. What was most maddening was that ample food was so near. Twice that fall, Red Cross relief packages had been delivered for the POWs, but instead of distributing them, camp officials had hauled them into storage and begun taking what they wanted from them. They made no effort to hide the stealing. We could see them throwing away unmistakable wrappers, carrying bowls of bulk cocoa and sugar between huts, and even trying to wash clothes with cakes of American cheese, wrote Tom Wade. The Bird was the worst offender, smoking Lucky Strike cigarettes and openly keeping Red Cross food in his room. From one delivery of 240 Red Cross boxes, the Bird stole 48, more than 500 pounds of goods. So remember, the Red Cross is trying to get food and supplies and things like that to these men, but the prison guards keep stealing it. Toward the end of December, the Bird ordered all of the men to the compound, where they found a truck brimming with apples and oranges. In all of his time as a POW, Louis had seen only one piece of fruit, the tangerine that Sasaki had given him. The men were told that they could take 2 pieces each. As the famished men swarmed onto the pile, Japanese photographers circled, snapping photos. Then, just as the men were ready to devour the fruit, to eat it down, the order came to put it all back. The entire thing had been staged for propaganda. So they just wanted pictures to make it look like they were taking care of the prisoners. They weren't actually going to let them eat it. On Christmas Eve, some Red Cross packages were finally handed out. Louis wrote triumphantly of it in his diary. His box, weighing some 11 pounds, contained corned beef, cheese, pâté, salmon, butter, jam, chocolate, milk, prunes, and 4 packs of Chesterfields. All evening long, the men of Amori traded goods, smoked, and gorged themselves. They just ate it all. That night there was another treat, and it came about as the result of a series of curious events. Among the POWs was a chronically unwashed, ingenious, and possibly insane kleptomaniac, one of our vocab words, from earlier, meaning someone who's addicted to stealing. So this is like really dirty but clever, maybe crazy person who is addicted to stealing named Mansfield. Shortly before Christmas, Mansfield broke into the storehouse, slipping past 7 guards, and made off with several Red Cross packages, which he buried under his barracks. Discovering his cache, guards locked him in a cell. Mansfield broke out, stole 16 more parcels, and snuck them back into his cell. He hid the contents of the packages in a secret compartment he'd fashioned himself, marking the door with a message for other POWs. Food, help yourself, lift here. Caught again, he was tied to a tree in the snow without food or water, wearing only pajamas, and beaten. By one account, he was left there for 10 days. Late one night, when Louis was walking back from the Benjo, He saw the camp interpreter, Yukichi Kano, kneeling beside Mansfield, draping a blanket over him. The next morning, the blanket was gone, retrieved before the bird could see it. Eventually, Mansfield was untied and taken to a civilian prison where he flourished. So first, this is awesome. He steals a whole bunch of stuff, right? But then he's punished really severely for it. But once again, we see an example of one of these guards at the prison camp who is trying to help out the prisoners, but then has to also be fearful of the bird, right? He has to take the blanket away before the bird sees it. The one good consequence of this event was that in the storehouse, Mansfield had discovered a Red Cross theatrical trunk. He told other POWs about it, and this gave the men the idea of boosting morale by staging a Christmas play. So boosting morale is like lifting everyone's spirits, trying to cheer people up. They secured the bird's approval by stroking his ego, so by telling him that he's awesome, naming him Master of Ceremonies, the MC, and giving him a throne at the front of the theater, the bathhouse, outfitted with planks perched on wash tubs to serve as a stage. The men decided to put on a musical production of Cinderella, written with creative liberties by a British POW. Frank Tinker put his operatic gifts to work as Prince Leander of Pentoland. The fairy godmother was played by a mountainous Cockney Brit dressed in a tutu and tights. Characters included Lady Diarrhea and I think that's actually diarrhea and Lady Gonorrhea. So you're getting diarrhea and gonorrhea. Louis thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Private Kano translated for the guards, who sat in the back laughing and clapping. The bird gloried in the limelight, and for that night, he let Louis and the others be. At Sensuji, Christmas came to Phil and Fred Garrett. Some POWs scrounged up musical instruments and assembled in the camp. Before 700 starving men, they played rousing music as the men sang along. They ended with the national anthems of England, Holland, and the United States. The Zensuji POWs stood together at attention in silence, thinking of home. After Christmas, the bird abruptly stopped attacking the POWs, even Louis. So just really suddenly stops. He paced about camp, brooding. The men watched him and wondered what was going on. Several times that year, a dignitary, so like a high-up political kind of famous person, named Prince Yoshitomo Tokugawa had come to camp. A prominent and influential man, so an important man, reportedly a descendant of the first shogun, Tokugawa was touring camps for the Japanese Red Cross. At Amori, he met with POW Louis Bush, who told him about the bird's cruelty. The bird was suspicious. After Tokugawa first visited, the bird forbade Bush from speaking to him again. When the prince returned, Bush defied the bird, who beat him savagely as soon as the prince left. Tokugawa kept coming, and Bush kept meeting with him. The bird slugged and kicked Bush, but Bush refused to be cowed. Deeply troubled by what he heard, Tokugawa went to the War Office and the Red Cross and pushed to have something done about Watanabe. He told Bush that he was encountering resistance. Then, just before the new year, the prince at last succeeded. The bird was ordered to leave Amori. Tokugawa's victory was a hollow one. Officials made no effort to take the bird out of contact with POWs. They simply ordered his transfer to a distant, isolated camp, where he'd have exactly the same sway over prisoners without the prying eyes of the prince and the Red Cross. So they get the bird transferred, but it's not like they get him fired or get him to work in an office. He's just in a new camp where no one will catch him as he abuses prisoners. Ensuring that no censure, or trying to stop, no censure of Watanabe was implied, Colonel Sakaba promoted him to sergeant. So not only does he not get really in trouble, he gets a promotion. The bird threw himself a goodbye party and ordered some of the POW officers to come. The officers dashed around the camp to gather stool samples from the greenest dysentery patients. Okay, so bits of poop from the most recent dysentery people, mixed up a ferocious gravy and slathered it over a stack of rice cakes. Okay, rice cakes covered in diarrhea poop. When they arrived at the party, they presented the cakes to the bird as a token of their affection. While the men lavished the bird with lamentations on how they'd miss him, so while they poured on thick all of how sad they are that he's going to be gone, the bird ate heartily. He ate it. He seemed heartbroken to be leaving. Later that day, Louis looked out on the barracks and saw the birds standing at the gate in a group of people shaking hands. All of the POWs were in a state of high animation, like they're almost acting cartoonish. Their emotions are overboard. Louis asked what was happening, and someone told him that the bird was leaving for good. Louis felt almost out of his head with joy. If the rice cakes performed as engineered, they didn't do so quickly. The bird crossed the bridge onto the mainland, looking perfectly well. At Amori, the reign of terror was over. And on that semi-happy note, let's pause.